Hello, everyone. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from. You can also let us know what brought you here today. What part of the country are you in? Are you interested in linguistics? Are you interested in languages, dialects? Yeah, it looks like we almost have everyone here. So yeah, let us know what brought you here or where you are. Valerie's in the biggest little city, which we know is Reno. And I'm actually not at the Mark Twain house right now because it is closed up for the day. This is a virtual background, and I am at home in East Hartford, Connecticut, which is right over the river from Hartford, where the Mark Twain house is. Looks like we have someone from New York, Chicago, Branford in Connecticut, Lexington, Massachusetts, Granby, Connecticut. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'll do my introduction and then we'll go right into the discussion. Hi, if you're joining us here for the first time, my name is Omar Acevedo and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. First, I need to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, the House and Museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and many, many more things. I'll put a link in the chat right now, and you can take a look at that and contact us if you're interested in becoming a member. Now on to our program. I'm delighted to host this program for Like Literally Dude, arguing for the good in bad English, a lively linguistic exploration of the speech habits we love to hate and why our likes and literallys actually make us better communicators. Our author, Valerie Fridland, is a professor of linguistics in the English department at the University of Nevada, Reno. She writes a popular language blog on Psychology Today called Language in the Wild, and is also a professor for the Great Courses series. Our moderator, Tamaya Levy, is a master's student of linguistics at Northeastern Illinois University. Actually getting ready to graduate. Congratulations. Her research interests include sociophonetics, African American language, AAL, and racial linguistics. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat as Valerie and Tamaya are having theirs. If you have a specific question, though, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on captions to see live auto captioning for the program. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase Like Literally Dude through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guests. And somewhat ironically, I have said less ums in this little speech in my little script than I have in the past. Let's get into that, into why we say all these ums and likes. Please sit back and enjoy. Over to you, Valerie and Tamaya.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you, Valerie, for joining us today and talking about your new book.
Absolutely.
First and foremost, I wanted to know, can you tell us about the writing process for the book and what was really the inspiration for writing it?
Sure, absolutely. First, I just want to tell Omar, I usually have the opposite effect on people. They and more that when they meet me than when they don't. So I've never had that influence on anybody. But yes, I give a lot of public talks, and I'm a professor, so I've lectured for years, many, many years. I won't tell you exactly how many. But I noticed that in my classes and at public lectures, I got asked the same questions over and over again. They often weren't exactly related to what I had just lectured on or the talk I had just given, which was usually about larger forces of sociolinguistic language change. So why languages change over time, or who drives language, or what are some cool new things happening to our vowels in language. Instead, they were questions about the things people notice around them in speech. So the likes that populate everybody's teens talk, or their own, or the literally used non-literally. I heard a lot about that one. Or ums and uhs, things that people thought of as bad speech. I don't think even once did anybody come up to me and say, hey, I love like, it's so cool. Can you explain how it got there? Not once, never. So I thought, well, I need to help unpack linguistics for people that are trying to figure out why these features come in their speech. And the only voice out there is the voice of prescriptivism, the voice that tells us those are bad English. And I'm not really writing this book to discount prescriptivism. I think there's a time and a place for it, but I don't think most people understand where prescriptivists came from, where the ideas of the complaint culture came from, nor do they see these features as being emergent from underlying linguistic tendencies that have always been at work in language. So instead of decay, they're actually evolution. And I thought maybe if I can share the history of many of these features, which date back centuries, as well as the linguistic science that underlies them, maybe we can understand why we use them, where we use them, and also how they might actually be helpful.
Yes. I definitely experienced a lot of hypercorrection, I guess, with me myself speaking African American English or language, especially in high school, the axing, or people would be like, are you cutting down a tree? And it was almost like we can't really separate the language from its speakers, because often the things we say about the language is what we're saying about the people speaking that language. So it's almost like a question, a follow-up question is, why do we have these prescriptivist ideas of language, or where do they come from?
Well, I think that's a really good question that people probably don't think about too much, because it's been instilled in them since they were very, very little. Even with our parents before we go to school, a lot of times our parents correct us. They correct us in terms of forms. Now, of course, sometimes it's because we're saying the wrong thing or we have the wrong word. But a lot of times it's even things like when a child says, I goed, which is actually a natural process and it will correct itself over time. But what they're doing is recognizing a rule of language. The ED is a rule of language. So this is a natural linguistic rule. I've learned as a child getting input that most past tense are formed with ED. So you correct the child, no, I went, or I had gone, which is fine because that actually is the form for that verb. But it's this idea of correction that we get into early on. And then we go to school and we learn about all our social preferences, but instead of learning them as social preferences, like don't end a sentence with a preposition, or don't, split your infinitives, and certainly don't dangle your modifiers. That would be really bad. We don't realize that those are actually rules that were adopted in the 18th century. They're not part of language itself. They're part of our preferences for language. We learn them as if they're a rule of language, but actually they're a social rule. And so when we learn them as these rules, and we learn them every day, every year we go to school, and from the time we were with our parents, it's really hard to see another viewpoint. It's hard to understand any other sign of language. But if you start to look at language a little bit like a linguist, which is something we don't teach kids to do, you might start to see a different side of language and understand a little more what drives our feelings about the forms that we use.
Mm-hmm. So the standards aren't really norms, or they're created and then they become socialized norms or uses of language.
Right. I think there's a big difference between a rule and a norm, and that's sort of what's key. Norm is what people do as a community. That's what we've adopted. It can also be what people do in terms of assigning prestige to something. You can have a prestige norm, and that's typically what we learn in school. But that's a little different than a rule. And when we talk about rules of language, I'm not saying language has no rules. In fact, language is incredibly rule governed, and we wouldn't be able to understand each other if it wasn't. So, for example, when I say something like, John knew that Frank saw himself in the mirror. How do we know who himself refers back to? Because there's two potential antecedents, right? There's Frank and there's John. Well, none of us make that mistake. All of us know it's the one in the lower clause. So when I say John knew that Frank saw himself, we know it's Frank. But if I say John knew that Frank saw him, Then I could be referring to anybody but Frank, right? It can't be the subject. That's something we know even before we go to school, and no one explicitly teaches us that. We don't go to kindergarten and learn who himself is. No one learns that, but we know it, and young children do it correctly. So that is a rule of language, and it's something called principles A and B of binding theory, to get really fancy. But we actually can articulate the rules as linguists, but they're unconscious rules as speakers. So those are the rules that actually drive language. So when we think about language change as decay, it really can't be, because language doesn't allow the rules of language to be broken, but it does allow social rules to be broken. And sometimes we confuse those two because we have a lot of grammarian angst.
Yeah. And it's almost like we have these notions of how folks should talk. And then when they kind of behave outside of this is when they're othered or kind of chastised. And we almost see the same thing happening with certain linguistic variables that you wrote about in your book, like ing or in, and orlessness. Can you talk more about those?
Oh, sure. Those are features that people react to and respond to, but they often don't quite know what they're responding to. So when you hear someone say, I was walking and I was talking and we were going, you are actually noticing, if you're talking to someone, that they're doing that variation versus I was walking and I was talking and I was going. That's a different variation. And we pick up subtle social cues from that variation that people do. And we don't necessarily consciously notice it, but a lot of times we notice when we are reading scripts or reading literary works and they're doing dialogue, that in order to get a more informal or often colloquial feel, or often when they're trying to depict working class characters, they will do that apostrophe on the in to represent G dropping, is what it's often called, because they want to get that sense across of this greater informality, this greater working classness, this kind of it can sometimes be macho, it can sometimes be tough. It has this sensibility. A lot of times it's considered Southern. So we have these social senses we get, or we read people when they say these things in various ways. But all of us actually alternate between in and ing. It's the degree to which we do it that sends different social messages. We have very strong attitudes about that. So when we have someone that ins too much, we find when we look at perceptual studies that can actually affect ratings of those speakers on professional qualities quite substantially, even with one in. If you say subsequent ings, it can't seem to correct that view that people had of you as being less professional or less employable. So we have strong feelings about these, even though we all use them in different ways. And the really interesting thing is there are two myths about our ing that we buy into lock, stock, and barrel. One is that there's actually a G on the end because it's written with a G, but it's actually what linguists refer to as a velar nasal. I'm sure you're familiar with that in your studies. And that alternates between the alveolar nasal, which is that place on your roof of your mouth you burn with pizza. If everybody has done that, I'm sure. If you stick your tongue on that spot and go, you notice that's an N sound. But if you pull your tongue a little further back to the palate behind it and go, you can hear that it goes into more of a ng sound, which is actually what's on the end of the ing. The reason we think there's a G on it is because it dates back to Old English when it came from an ending inge, which was inge. But the inge ending in Old English that we now use for a progressive was actually an ending for derived nouns. So nouns like evening, for example, was a word used that was made in Old English with that ending. The actual progressive form in Old English, it was a participial form because progressives were relatively rare at the time, was an end inde, inde. So it was inde for progressives and participles and inge for derived nouns. Those became conflated over the years in the Middle English period because of sound changes that basically dropped the sounds off the ends. So we dropped the G and we dropped the E off the end, the vowel and the consonant, and we dropped the D and we dropped the E off the end. And when you do that, you get in, just in, no ing, no end, just in. So if you look back in the 1700s and you find writings about that sound, what you see is reference to the proper form being in, not ing. In fact, in some writings, Jonathan Swift rhymes doing with ruin, which doesn't sound very good if you do it the way we say today, but it was doing and ruin. And you can also find pronunciation guides that rhyme words like coffin and coughing. So obviously it was an in pronunciation, but what changed is literacy. And the more literate people got, and the more they saw it written with the G, because that had been the spelling that got adopted in the small amounts of writing that were done in Middle English period. And people thought there was a G on the end. And then therefore they started to say it as ing, thinking there was a G. So it's really a myth that there's even a G, and it's the wrong ending. But yet we really we hold very firm to our beliefs about which one's right and which one's wrong.
And even they're very like small but meaningful, like linguistic variables.
Tiny,
like,
tiny, tiny. Yes.
Yeah. And they're socially marked. And even the perception study you mentioned was about how we have these ideas of like competency and articulation, but these aren't examples of like lazy, sloppy speech, right?
Absolutely not. And that's really what we call it. But the funny thing is that would assume that someone's dropping a sound, which they're actually not doing. It's a one-to-one sound correlation. And the weird thing about the way we think about speech is that we think about it in this cultural moment, and we think about it in terms of what we think is good and bad. But dropping sounds has actually been something that historically we have done a lot of. For example, the word often. If you look at the writing, there's a little T in there. And in fact, some people say often, and they get ridiculed for it today. Well, let me tell you, that was the original form. We dropped that T about in the 15th century. So we've dropped a lot of sounds in our language. For example, night and knife. We've lost several sounds. Night used to be genicht, and we don't say it that way anymore. So this idea that dropping sounds is somehow bad is a funny, strange thing to begin with. But certainly in that case, it's not even a drop sound. But what happens is we have these beliefs about what we think about the speakers that use it. And our beliefs about and stereotypes about those speakers get put on the forms that they use. And since mostly it's lower class speakers and Southern speakers are strongly marked for in, that we have ideas about that aren't necessarily socially favored, then we start thinking about anybody who does those speech features have those same characteristics. And in fact, there was a really interesting study done by Tyler Kendall and Charlotte Vaughn, who had a baby yesterday. I just want to say thank you, congratulations to them. Yes. They did a study where they asked people to do in endings on their ing forms, and that's all they told them. Here, read this reading passage, and instead of ing, say in. They found that those speakers who were not Southern started adopting all sorts of Southern traits. It's that strongly inscribed in our psyche that means you're more Southern, that they started doing things like drawling and I monophthization, like Todd and tot. And that came on just naturally from them adopting those features. So we clearly have very strong correlations in our heads about ideologies of speakers and ideologies about language.
Mm-hmm. And that definitely brings in the conversation of like power and language. And so you mentioned like the speech habits we love to hate. And it's interesting seeing like who's using these features and how they're being perceived differently. So again, like who's leading this language change that we see?
Well, I don't think it's going to surprise anybody that usually it's the young. No one doubts that. But I think what's a little more surprising is when we look at records of historical change and records of contemporary change, we find that it's particular groups of young speakers. It's females more than males, and it's working class speakers more than middle or upper class speakers. And this seems to be a pattern that has been true for centuries. When we look at early modern changes, a lot of the changes came from the working class or the lower class in that era, and in women's letters and diaries more often than men's letters and diaries. So we obviously don't have recordings from the early modern period. They didn't have a lot of iPhones back then, which would have really been so useful to linguists, but maybe less useful to them as people, since we're finding that out probably these days. But we have letters, we have diaries, we have plays that represent their speech. And what we find when we look at that is things like the progressive, which was considered colloquial in that period, is used more in lower class and women's letters, using you for subjects instead of ye, because you is actually an object pronoun. And it was a plural only pronoun, and now we use it for singular and we use it for subject. So it's the same thing as saying him and me are going to the party. When you use a you, that's exactly the change that had happened in our previous history. That was also in lower class and women's letters more. And not just in English, when we look in other languages. So in French, the deletion of the ne particle that's at the beginning of negatives, that's become prevalent in casual speech. So instead of je ne parle pas, you'd say je ne parle pas. That actually also in the early 19th and 20th century started in lower class speech and in women's speech. So it's this recurrent pattern of younger speakers leading the charge, but primarily lower class and women in that group.
And then one of the features that was really interesting was vocal fry. And a lot of people associate it with women, but men do it too. So can you explain what is vocal fry and why do we kind of notice it more in women's speech?
Sure. Vocal fry is a really interesting one because I think a lot of people would think that it is something that's new and something that women are leading in. And certainly women in American dialects are doing it more than men. We have established that about twice as much as men. But that really seems to be a cultural thing because when you look at different speakers of English. So for example, in one of the studies that studied young college age men and women, they found that the young women were using vocal fry about twice as much as the young men who were also using it. But Japanese women in that study, it was a study done in California, did not use much vocal fry and in fact used no more than the men did in that study. When we look in Britain, where vocal fry was really first studied, in studies done in the 1980s, it was considered a hyper masculine feature, with men using it 3 to 10 times more than women, depending on dialect. What seems to have happened is around the 2000s, the early 2000s, we start to see a lot of vocal fry in broadcast media. So in newscasts and newscasters and on the radio and journalists. And that seems to be when we start to notice vocal fry as prominent in women's voices, which might mean that we have overestimated the amount that it was actually in more generalized women's voices at that time, but that provided a little bit of an impetus and a model. And one of the reasons we find that is probably because of all the criticism of women in broadcasting having shrill voices, high-pitched voices, squeaky voices. And in fact, this was something that has been a criticism of women in broadcasting since they started moving into broadcasting. So if you put on a little vocal fry, that's a low-pitched affectation. So it's your vocal folds being bunched up and a little heavier, so they vibrate a little slower. This often happens towards the ends of phrasal units or sentences, and it's probably because the airflow is a little less. So it basically, if you think of your vocal fry, your vocal folds as this, they're kind of bunched up and heavy, and they just kind of start being more regular rather than that regular vibration pattern. So it's really a social signal, though. It started to be used as a social signal of various things, whether it's relaxed and intimate, which seems to be part of this newscaster. The NPR vocal fry is we're having this relaxed and intimate conversation, but also to establish professionalism for women's voices because it's a low-pitched vocal style. And we find very overwhelmingly in evolutionary psychology studies and social psychology studies that low-pitched voices are much more valued in leadership, dominance, authority scales than high-pitched voices. But for women, high-pitched voices are more valued for attractiveness. So a woman just adopting a low pitch generally gets called out for it. I mean, look at Elizabeth Holmes with that company, I think it was Theranos, the blood company. She was on trial for fraud. One of the biggest things people commented about with her was her low-pitched voice being fake. And so if a woman tries to lower her pitch in that way, it might come across as inauthentic. But if you adopt a little low-pitched vocal fry, you can get both this sort of social bump for having more authority in your voice, but also keep this more attractive feminine style of your regular high pitch.
So it's almost they're adopting this specific or using it as a stylistic move in speech.
Absolutely. And not all languages use it stylistically. Some languages actually have vocal fry as a meaningful difference, so that if you make a sound with vocal fry, it changes the meaning of that sound. So that's a linguistic use of vocal fry, which also points out that vocal fry, it doesn't damage the vocal folds. Now, sometimes it is co-allocated with damaged vocal folds, but that's usually because there's some underlying problem, not because the vocal fry did the damage, which is something that I think a lot of speech pathologists have thought to be the case.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned like vocal fry kind of had this kind of outburst, I guess, with the media. So how would you say that the media and technology has changed language as well?
You know, I think there's many ways. First of all, we get messaging in a much more uniform way, in the sense of instead of hearing things from our neighbors and our friends and maybe 3 broadcasts that we all watch, we have so many different places to get it from, but it spreads really far out. So one source can be much more extensive than it was before, but also we have multiple sources, and we can kind of find our truth in that way, in the sense of we tend to get more attracted to things that are homophilous, meaning they're more similar to the beliefs that we hold. And so in that sense, we can have our beliefs and our ideas and our language reaffirmed by what we hear on media and newscasts. But also it spreads things much more quickly, particularly among young speakers who use social media and use texting extensively to communicate and to far broader networks than they had before. So something that some guy in his basement in Chicago might say with his bud on social media, all of a sudden becomes this mass viral sensation, and then it gets spread really far. But the trick is a lot of that's vocabulary oriented. So a lot of the real substantive change that happens in our language, so changes in morphosyntactic structure, so how we put together sentences, changes in sounds over time, those are actually things that we need contact with speakers to have. So those kinds of changes are actually slow, and they don't get promoted that much by television and radio, but they can be broadcast by that. So if something like vocal fry gets into the media and it gets picked up as this new thing, it can make it more visible to people than it was before. And that can perhaps speed up its spread.
Okay. So is there a reason why people are kind of opting into kind of maybe co-opt or use these features in terms of like when they're in the media?
It has a lot to do with who's using the features originally. So one of the things we noticed about language change is it requires social triggers. Language change is sort of this underlying percolating pressure that's on language all the time. There are certain ways our brains work, and there are certain ways our mouths work. And that drives language forward. So, for example, there are preferences in syllable structure over time. All languages have syllables that are consonant and vowels, but not that many languages have syllables that are much bigger than that, which tells us that there's probably some inherent pressure to get back towards that more natural syllable shape. And in fact, when we look at language change over time, we find that languages often change in ways to get back to that preferred syllable structure. Or sounds that go together in words might affect the other sounds. So when I say an S in front of a T and an R, what we find is there's a new change where people say that sometimes as string or street, where it's like this SH sound. And that often happens because of co-articulatory tendencies. So the R sound causes backing of the tongue. So these are underlying pressures. The difference is in different dialects is certain underlying pressures go forward in some groups and not others. And some groups resist all these pressures. So they work really hard not to let them into their speech because they are bound and elevated by the speech features they use. But when a certain type of speaker uses a feature that at a very low level allows some of these natural pressures to come into their language or invents a new word, and there's something cool or attractive about that speaker, some quality associated with their speaker group. And that doesn't mean just that they're rich and wealthy and fabulous. It could be they're fabulous and cool, and they come from a nonconformist subculture that makes people really find them attractive. It can be all sorts of different things. Then those get picked up and spread. And what we find is on the internet, subcultures are incredible purveyors of language change, and particularly vocabulary. And it's been quite a while now that African-American culture has been a source of many of the words that permeate youth culture, because the stereotypes about users of those features is that they're kind of street and gangsta and cool. And so particularly young white men in high school, in adolescence, who take those features as part of their identity building and want to present that persona, co-opt those features so that they get a bit of that type of attitude and style in their own speech. And we also see a lot of that with drag culture as well. So subcultures and minoritized cultures are often where we get a lot of our features from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like there's definitely a similar transition with the word dude. And so, so can you tell us a little about where that word came from, how it evolved, and also its unique connection to Mark Twain?
Sure. Well, dudes are amazing. I love the dude because it has such a fascinating history. And it started in the late 1800s and about 1880s, about the time Mark Twain was writing. And the dude was an effeminate dandy with an ostentatious regard for his dress. And he was usually wealthy, self-absorbed, self-affected, and a real jerk, essentially. And we never see dudes as complimentary in this period. In fact, in New York, there were many articles in the New York Times at the time about defamation lawsuits and duels inspired by people calling each other dudes. The female form was not dude at the time, it was a dudette, but it wasn't used that often. But when we look at, for example, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, we see dude used in this way. So when we read about the Iron Dudes, or we see the picture with the subtitle, the Iron Dude, and the ye that's written in the book is actually interesting, but it's really a the. Then we see that actually we think of them as Iron Men, right? We might picture, is it Robert Downey Jr. that plays that role? But that's not at all what Twain meant. He meant this ostentatious, showy, kind of overdressed, out of place, never actually going to do anything for anybody kind of vibe. And what happened around the turn of the century, it started to also mean anybody dressed in a really showy way. And that could be someone that was in a really new uniform or dressed as a knight, something like that, but that stood out for their clothes and maybe hadn't really done the thing that the clothes said they would do. So for example, someone who was a new police recruit wearing the really starched new outfit, but they hadn't really actually been a policeman yet. So it was still kind of pejorative in that way. It gets picked up in the 1930s by the zoot suiters. So African Americans and Mexican American pachuchos really adopted the term to call each other dudes because of their really signature style of the zoot suit. And what people don't realize is zoot suits were really called out as bad, evil fashion at the time because they used a lot of material and also because they tended to be associated with minoritized subcultures. And they were often the cause of riots and insults. And so part of this whole embodiment of the dude at the time and them calling each other dudes was not just about the clothes. It was about the solidarity and the edgy counterculture vibe that they adopted by becoming part of that group. And so this is what actually got adopted by surfer and druggie subculture as that really chill, laid back counterculture dude that was too cool to care. And that's where the dude became really cool. In Mark Twain's day, you would not have wanted to be a dude, and Mark Twain certainly wouldn't have wanted to be called a dude.
And now I also see dude being used in non-gendered ways, like bro, you guys, like even like, hey man, and so
Yes, absolutely.
So when do we start to see the kind of like this shift or this type of language change from being like very specific to being referred to as to the people who identify as men to now being used in these non-gender unisex ways?
It's a really interesting transition, and actually one that many words in English make in one direction, right? We generally don't see men being called by female terms, but we do see the other thing happen quite a bit, which we can see often when people say, hey guys, or you guys. It's the same sort of shift. And what happens is whatever qualities associated with those words gets degendered, and other aspects of what they're used for seem to become more prominent. So in the case of dude, we find a lot of times dude became not just a greeting, not just a way you call it to people, but often a signal of, for example, non-confrontation. So if you had we're roommates and you had done something like, left your pizza box out for 3 days and I was kind of getting sick of it, I might say, dude, the pizza. And dude says, hey, we're buddies. I get this. We're chill. We're okay, but still. So it's basically a way to offset confrontation. And it can also be used way for commiseration. So for example, maybe we just took a really hard exam and we're just commiserating afterwards. And I could say, dude, that was painful. And you just say, dude. So whenever you start to get a meaning associated with those words that has less to do with the gender and more to do with the feeling and emotion or a quality, then that becomes alienable. That means it can be adopted by other people for whom that same quality, that same goal, that same function is appropriate. And that's when women can become dudes. Really interestingly, though, when we look at who dudes each other, when we see studies of dude use, Scott Kiesling is sort of the dude master in terms of linguists studying it. In his study, he found that men did report using dude with female friends, but not with girlfriends. So part of the attraction of using dude seems to be this sort of non-romantic solidarity in particular. So if you're calling your date a dude, you're probably not expecting a goodnight kiss.
And then, so this process of dude is it going under de-lexification process, or is that something really for your adverbial intensifiers, like literally, that you talk about in your book?
I think that sort of semantic bleaching, where a word sort of starts losing its original meaning and taking only one aspect that's more grammatical, I think that really probably doesn't describe dude, which still has a meaning, but that meaning is just becoming more broad in general. I think so. That would be more like a semantic broadening, I think, in that case. But a word like literally, that has started to take on an aspect of being a degree word rather than having its literal meaning. That would be more of a case of delexification.
Mhm. And so you talk about like how literally once meant something quite different than it does today. Like, can you explain that?
Well, I think a lot of people are still upset over the fact that it still means that original thing, and they don't like the new figurative use, probably because the figurative use of something being literally awful or you being literally frozen is the opposite of the actual fact of being literally frozen. So I think that's what gets people's goat. But what's interesting is when we look at adverbial intensification, which is what that is, where you use a word to sort of mark an emphatic or hyperbolic degree of something, we find that words that have become intensifiers that we use every day, words like really and very, originally once meant real, true, or actual, the same way that that's what literal meant. Because the idea of anything being true or actual is essentially that it has 100% of the degree of whatever you're describing. So we find that shift with very, for example, which originally meant true or actual only. So you would see that Jesus would be called a very prophet, a true prophet in early forms of the Bible. But we also see Chaucer use it in things like he was very in word and deed, obviously with a better Middle English accent, but that would be true in word and deed. But then in another line, he'd say something like he was a very proper fool, where he starts to use it. It's starting to creep into the sense of having more of a degree sense than a sense of truth itself. And that's how we see this creep of very going from being true to, by the 17th century, being mainly about being very, being much. Although we still see it used sometimes in true or actual when we say, on this very spot, he died. And that means on this very actual spot, on this actual spot. So literally is doing the exact same thing. The problem we're having with it is it's doing it in our lifetime, and we still hold tight to that original meaning. And I don't think it's going to replace the literal that means true or actual. It's going to exist side by side in the same way that I can still say something is real, meaning true or actual, but also say something is really good or real good as it comes around these days. So we're going to have that meaning coexist. I think the real thorn in the side of purist is that it's the opposite meaning. But if you've ever used the word hardly, you should not be complaining, because hard means difficult. And that actually is the original meaning of the word, vigorously or with great difficulty. But when we say it was hardly a problem, we certainly don't mean that. So it's really opposite its original meaning. And so there's a number of words that have done that, have semantically bleached so that they don't mean what they originally meant. And they are more sort of helper words or grammatical forms. And literally is just another case of that.
Okay. And kind of like a follow-up question to like this idea of language purity and how would you respond to language purists?
I've met quite a few of them. I hear from them often. You know, I have my own form of language purity, and I'm not trying to dismiss the views that people have about prescriptivism. And I think there are certainly places like writing where it's absolutely appropriate. I think the trick is, what we don't realize is a lot of what we take to be correct, to be good English, which is actually really just disliked English, are based on very, very strong class norms from the 18th century. So there wasn't anything inherently good about those forms. In fact, many forms that we call good today were bad in earlier centuries. There really is just a matter of who was the one that codified it. And it was the upper class that were codifying their norms, because in the 18th century, the class divides had started to break down with the Industrial Revolution, the shifting class culture, mass migration to London, a lot of dialects coming into London at the time. The one marker of aristocratic birth was language. And so people were really intense on codifying that language to share it, really, basically to sell it is really the truth, to sell it to those who were with upward mobility, hoping to aspire to higher classes. So one of the things that people disdained that were born into wealth was that these nouveau riche, middle class people that had become wealthy, usually the merchant class in that era, were now hobnobbing with them, but they didn't say things like they dropped their H's, or they didn't have their yods, or they used you for ye, you know, things like that. And so this is when we see this impetus to codify words in grammar books and usage guides, because there was a huge market from the middle class, the rising middle class, to adopt the norms of the upper class, because that's who they were aspiring to be. So these are class-based norms. There's nothing correct about them. And in fact, many of those forms, like H dropping and yaw dropping, are things we do in our speech every day now. So if you've ever said white or whip, you've dropped your H's, because it was supposed to be white and whip. And in fact, Noah Webster calls it lazy and careless for Americans to do that. So we have these beliefs that are really based on class-based distinctions. And it's okay to understand, to like things. It's okay to dislike things. I'm not arguing with that. You can have your likes and your dislikes in language, but recognize them as likes and dislikes tied to social classes and social powers, rather than good and bad English, because they're not good and bad English. They're liked and disliked English. And that's the key difference. And that's all I'm trying to get across, and have people understand the history of how they got to be where they are.
Yes, yes. Do we have time for one more question? Should we open up to Q&A now?
Yeah, you have time for one more question.
Perfect. And I just really wanted to say, like, I'm very fascinated in language variation, especially with regards to different varieties of English. And so we see like these imposing of standards is kind of erasing or trying to erase personality and creativity in folks' languaging. So kind of what are the values of these features that you talked about in your book?
Absolutely. I mean, the majority of features come about because they're doing some social work for us, and a lot of times a grammatical work. So if we look at like, for example, which I think is probably the #1 feature people bring to my attention as disliked. And if we look at what it's doing, it's not a crutch word and it's not meaningless. It may be dispreferred, and some people might lean on it too heavily. I'm not saying that people should use it every word, but what we find is it's replacing adverbials that are used for approximation. It's replacing about, so it's a one-to-one replacement. It's replacing the verb to say, to add this ability to talk about what you were thinking and processing during an event, rather than just verbatim talking about. So it's highly functional. So part of its function, part of these words come up because there's no word in our language that adequately does the job that we want those to do. But why do you use like instead of about? They're same thing. If I said he was like 12 versus he's about 12, you're doing the exact same semantic work. Well, what's the difference? I'm much hipper, cooler, and more laid back if I'm saying like than about. And that's this quality that this brings to us. It brings back an identification with a certain group. So for like, it's often identified with young speakers. It's often identified with women. And it came into our language because young speakers were wanting to do those functions, and they wanted to stand out from the speakers that came before them. And this is just part of our natural evolution as young people, that we have a little bit more neural network activity. So we have more things we can do with language, more analysis of distributions, but we also very much want to be different and sort of step away from our parents. We also are in this intense period of social identity building, and all of these features are about social identity formation, and they declare us as members of groups. They declare us as having certain qualities. A lot of these are ephemeral, or a lot of them are hard to pin down. So they're things like urban, West Coast, you know, California has a lot of features it inspires. It can be rural, it can be country, it can be Southern, it can be African-American, it can be female. All of these qualities that are very subtle and are not outspoken get associated with the speakers that use these features. And that's why people adopt them, and they become popular primarily because they really help us build social identities and put on personas and build stances when we're talking. So they project an identity to the people that are listening to us. So there are two functions, and I think that's why they come about. One is that they meet a need that we don't have filled in our language, or that we need a new way of doing. And two, because they help us building our social identities and projecting those identities outward.
Yes, thank you so much.
Sure.
All right, for the questions in the chat here.
And yes, I love all the young dudes. I think it's hard to say which meaning David Bowie really had on that, or Mott the Hoople. I think David Bowie did that, right? But hard to know which meaning he was going for.
There's one question in the chat that's really interesting that you also talk about in your book is, can you comment on the current resistance to using gender neutral pronouns?
Absolutely. And I do have a chapter on that in my book because it's such an interesting, fascinating history, the history of our pronouns and why we tend to stand so strongly against it. And if you look at using singular they, for example, the use in generic non-specific context, so things like everyone loves their mother, or if anybody's going to the store, they should go now. That's been around in our language for 700 years. So we have obviously been trying to solve this problem of incorrect gender reference for a long, long time. And in fact, the pronouns he and they are not even native to English. They're not from Anglo-Saxon English. They came in when we started to realize we had problems with our Old English pronouns, discerning whether it was a he or a they or a she that were doing things. So she and they are actually later developments in about the 12th and 13th centuries. So obviously we've had a long history of having problems with our pronouns, and particularly around gender. And I think the difference for this current period with singular they is that it's gone from being the singular they use that was sort of accepted but not talked about and not accepted in usage guides to something that is actually based on a cultural and socio-cultural shift in terms of the way we view gender. And some people are having problems with different aspects of that. Some people have a problem with it on the immoral grounds. Something we heard actually when the shift from thou to you was occurring, the Quakers really felt that that was immoral, that shift, because it was in the face of God and everybody should be using plain speech. So we've seen these arguments about pronouns and godliness and correctness and morality for many centuries. But the second problem, and I think this is the one that many people who can put their head around the non-binary sense, but not put their head around the uses, that it's a subject-verb agreement problem. That people have not figured out exactly how to use they as a non-binary pronoun with a referent that has been gendered in their syntax. So if I say everyone can go to the store, they should go now, that doesn't have a gender marking on everyone. So it could be any kind of gender. But when I say John should take their tickets to the movie theater box office, that John is often gender marked in the syntax of people who have learned it, particularly those that are born before the millennial generation. And so then when we use they, we're not sure if we're using in a singular sense. Do we use it with a plural verb because that's what I'm used to, or because it's a singular referent, do we use it with a singular referent? But if I say something like anyone that wants to go, they should do this, or they are doing this, I use it with the plural pronoun. So when I'm using it in a singular sense before, I use it with the plural pronoun. And if we look at you, which was a plural pronoun that became singular, what do we use it with? The plural verb. So I think as we start to get more comfortable with the fact that that's okay to use a singular referent with a plural verb, and that's just a matter of practice, that discomfort will start to fade away for those that are not comfortable with it because of that reason. And in fact, a linguist named Kirby Conrad that did a study on how people adapted to using non-binary they found that it was millennials and those born after that seemed to not have so much of a problem with processing singular they in a non-binary way.
Right. And it's also like we see this, the neo-pronouns coming in. So why is it that we still want to kind of, we're leaning towards they and not they or zer?
Language usually goes in an organic direction, not one that we create. You know, you don't really see a lot of people speaking Esperanto anymore, nor Klingon, or any of those invented languages, because we tend to use what's emerged naturally in the language system. And I think it's Dennis Barron who has looked at all the substitutes for our third person pronouns that have come around, and there have been hundreds over the last several centuries. In fact, you know, I think in the 1800s was really where we first start seeing them. And we had examples like hisser and himmer, and my personal favorite, whore, which no wonder that one didn't catch on. But we had a lot of different ones. And thon, for example, which was a combination of that and one, was also developed and had a little more use at the time when it came about. But generally speaking, if you want someone to adopt something, it has to be something they buy into. And if one group says, oh, let's use thon, and they're not talking to this other group, and the other group has no reason to adopt what they're proposing, it's really hard to get your personal view out there. You know, I think we see this in politics all the time, right? You're fighting against an upward tide of people having different opinions. But if something emerges naturally and organically in language and it gets widespread currency without people even realizing they're doing it, like singular they has, then it's much more likely to be successful. And I think in the book, I liken it to a pair of shoes that you've worn around a lot. You might get them all shined up and you put new soles on them, but they're still going to be more comfortable than that new pair of shoes that you buy and they hurt for weeks when you first put them on, because that's not what you've already worn into your language. It's not what you've already worn onto your feet. And I think it's very much the same with they.
Yeah. One other question is, can you please address what has happened with the word amazing?
I'm guessing they're talking about how everything is amazing. We like hyperbolic expression. And one of the things we find is a lot of times we use intensity because we get bored with the ways we do it. So one of the most rapidly evolving parts of the English language has to do with intensifiers and intensity. And that's because when we're trying to talk to other people and express the depths of our emotion or express the depths of an experience, if we just say something is good, it's boring because we've had good for so long. Everything's good. And once everything has been good for so long, good doesn't stand out anymore. And that's why we constantly find intensification in this way. These words that are used to be emphatic and hyperbolic, they often come about and innovate quickly. In fact, it's been called the most rapidly evolving area of English for a reason, because we need new ways to stand out and make what we're saying have the emotional nuance and impact that we want it to. And that's where you get things like, it was amazing. It was awesome, because those are words that still carry that impact and they stand out. Those probably will also go the way of the dodo and fall into not being used quite as much. And some new word will come and take their place, because we have seen this to be the history of English, where these words come in and out of fashion. Sometimes they're recycled at later parts of our history, from history into contemporary usage, because we need something dynamic and new. And one of our motivations in communicating to people is helping them see our point of view and the depth of our emotional experience. And I think that's why we say things are amazing, but it is an amazing book. Just, I saw that in the thing.
I believe one participant asked about speech prosody such as uptalk and vocal fry again. Was there anything in particular you wanted to talk about with that? I don't know if they can answer us.
Well, I can just talk a little bit about uptalk, because I think we already talked about vocal fry. And I think what's really interesting, if you think about a lot of the words and sounds and intonational patterns that we're talking about, they're primarily associated with one group culturally, and that tends to be women. While we also know that men vocal fry, and particularly in British culture, it's quite a lot. It's really women's fry that's attracted notice. And in fact, in Britain, when we looked at qualities and rankings of vocal fry, it was considered a higher class feature that had authority. But when we talk about it in women's language in American culture, it's been called an epidemic and the verbal tick of doom. So I think we see that the views of features that women use in intonational patterns tends to be negative. And I think uptalk is very similar. Uptalk is the earlier form of language that was often criticized. I think vocal fry has taken over as the new worst quality of women's voices in people's view. But uptalk is interesting because it's actually quite the opposite of vocal fry. Uptalk is usually a continuation vocal pattern. So when you use uptalk, we find that on ratings of speakers that use uptalk and people that are asking what they mean by it, people say it means non-finality. So it's that you're messaging to your listener, I'm continuing what I'm going to say. I'm going to add something else. So a lot of times it's at the end of a phrase before you contribute a different phrase that further clarifies what you just said, or at the end of a sentence when you're about to continue with a secondary sentence to continue in your turn. So why would women find this a useful thing? Well, let's look at the history of women's talk and how it's been valued culturally, how it's been treated in terms of the desire to incorporate it in professional circles. And what we find in generally is, despite the belief that women talk more in places like professional circles, they do not. The studies show that in workplaces, they tend to not talk as much, particularly in meetings or even in Supreme Court justice arguments. We find that female Supreme Court justices are interrupted at higher rates than male Supreme Court justices by both males and females. So even in the highest areas of authority and power, we find this pattern of women's voices not being able to get out there. One thing you would do is signal to people when you're being interrupted a lot, I'm not done. What's a way to do this? Up talk. And particularly women in professional circles get criticized for this. And that's exactly the context in which they're most likely to be interrupted or not have their contributions welcomed. And this is a method for making sure there's continuity of their turn. So it's really interesting that people want to always put this rising intonation question form on it, as if there's no other use for intonational patterns in English. Yes, we do see rising intonation in some cultures, in American culture, for questions. It's not true of all cultures. Some cultures don't rise on the end for question intonation, but we do a lot of different things with intonational patterns, and rising intonation in the middle of a phrase does not signal questions. And that's just a way we further discount the users of those features. So hopefully that addressed that question.
I believe so. I hope so. And then there's a comment and a question in the Q&A, and so I'm just going to read it. I've noted that the people who make descriptivist language arguments are almost always themselves prescriptivists by training, habit, and practice. They're democratic in theory and patrician in action. Are there things that just grate on your ear that make you wince? They gave a really nice gift to Jerry and I. To be sure, no one will understand you if you say this, but it makes me wince just a little.
I'm not sure I got sort of the example, but I think, a lot of people wince. We all wince. I think it's okay to have preferences. I really do. I'm not saying that people shouldn't, but I think what we notice is this really strong need to judge other people's speech. And in fact, I think Mark Twain had a quote where he talks about there's nothing so bothersome as other people's habits. Something along that lines, where there's nothing that drives me more crazy than other people's bad habits. So, we somehow are very interested in critiquing people, even though we don't know the history of the features that they use. And we have this really firm belief that somehow they're unintelligible, they're worthless, it's meaningless, it's, creating the decay of language. And there is no scientific evidence to support that, because if you look at the history of English, we've gone from a language that had case markers, it had grammatical gender, it had plural markers, it had strong and weak verb classes. So ED was not the way you generally formed strong verbs in Old English. And in fact, more verbs were strong verbs at that time. So all of these things have decayed. But what English did is it shifted in other ways to accommodate the loss of those endings, to accommodate the loss of those markers on verbs. And what it did, it got a much more rigid word order, and it started to get lexified, where words did grammatical work instead of the markers that had been there. It is a natural use of language to be communicative. It's natural for us to come up with different ways to say things to meet the needs and new experiences that we have to encode. But language itself is driven by our need to communicate, and it will always rise up to shift in ways that accommodate whatever changes happen to it. So we see plenty of evidence in the historical record for more drastic changes than we're seeing today. I think what we have to step back and think is, who is it that uses the features we most dislike? And if we notice that there's a pattern, it's not because those people are stupid or useless, it's because we view them that way. Mm-hmm. And when we view people as stupid or useless, we listen to their language in a way that suggests that we think that about them. And so I get that we have dislikes, and certainly I cringe. I have teenagers, I cringe a lot. But I also worry less, because I also know that the things that they say that aren't useful for them will fall away. And we have good evidence for age grading, which is what that's called. So people that use like a lot at 17 will not use like to that same degree when they're 25 or 27, because the professional market won't tolerate it. And people adjust their speech in ways that make them get jobs that they want and things like that. So I think you just have to relax a little bit and kind of resist the urge to be such a purist.
And then there was another question in the chat, really great question. Do you know how the Romance languages handle gender issues, especially due to the fact that each noun is assigned a gender?
That's a really, really good question. And in fact, I have a blog on that in Psychology Today that I wrote just a few months ago, because it's such an interesting way that some languages are trying to handle it. We're not sure, and there's debatable research, I think it's controversial, but languages with grammatical gender do seem to orient readers to gender, our listeners to gender, in a way that languages without it, with natural gender, like English, where we do have gender, but it's in the pronouns, it correlates with natural gender. So we tend to use she for people assigned, female gender at birth. So that's a natural gender system, but you have other languages like Hebrew, for example, where gender is marked on every noun, and German, where you have often feminine, masculine, and neuter. And those don't necessarily always correlate with natural gender because, of course, the moon isn't gendered, a spoon isn't gendered, but usually when you have a word that is gendered, it does correlate, although that's not always the case. For example, I think in German, the word for girl is actually neuter, but generally speaking, we do find a correlation. But what we find is when we look at how people think about the objects that have gender in those languages, they do gender them in ways that are interesting. So that if we compare a language that has a feminine word, a feminine ending for moon, and we can that with a language that has a masculine ending. And I think German and Spanish are opposite in this way. The sun, I think for sure that one is masculine in that language, the other language has a feminine one. We find in poetry and things like that, that they're often more characterized as male or female and have attributes associated with male or female that are more gendered based on this grammatical gender. So there is some work that suggests that grammatical gender languages are more geared towards language in terms of the way speakers think about things. So you have a couple options. You can either move to terms that remove the gender ending, which some languages have done. So I think German, for example, has done that on some things where a word like professor or student, they have gotten rid of the endings. Or a lot of times what those languages do is they get an ending that's a combination of both. And so they are a generic form of those students. So those are not that widely accepted yet in many cases. And I think Hebrew has done something similar where they're taking these words and they're actually coming up with a novel form that combines both the masculine and feminine endings so that they refer to the plural that can be both. Whether speakers adopt those is the bigger question. And so, I think the jury's still out on that one.
And then I guess I just have one last question. Kind of what makes this book unique for readers? Because I heard something special about this book that I haven't heard about others.
Well, I think the book itself, no matter the format in which you read it, it offers a way to look at language historically and scientifically using the features that bug us and understanding how those are related to these larger ideas about language over time. But what I really am proud about with this book is the audiobook. For those that like to listen to an audiobook, I decided to do something really different. And luckily, Penguin Random House was incredibly supportive. They've been wonderful in this regard. We decided to audition voice actors for each chapter that has a vocal habit or vocal tic and try to fit that vocal habit historically and scientifically in terms of what we know about the users of that feature to the person reading the chapter. So I do read a couple of the chapters, just introductory stuff, but every vocal habit or tic in the book has a reader that somehow embodies that feature in a way that I found really special. And I'm hoping that will make it a really, really interesting listen, because you won't just be reading the experience, you'll be feeling the experience. You'll have the experience of a speaker. And these are not stereotypes. So it's not like you're going to have a Valley girl read the chapter on but you'll have a young professional woman reading that chapter. So, I try to play a little bit with these stereotypes, because even though we do have a few speakers that embody those stereotypes, the vast majority of women that use and men that use because young men also use it to a great degree, don't use it in the degree to which people disdain it. So, you can find a bunch of YouTube videos with people that say 500 times. That's not the average user. The average user is a young speaker who uses it here and there. And I've tried to get that embodied in the speakers that read the chapter books or the chapters.
I'm looking forward to listening to the book as well. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the questions, everyone. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Valerie, and Tamaya. Thank you so much for moderating. I'm definitely one of those people who uses amazing a lot, which is why I wrote it in that message. I especially use it a lot in text, in comments when I'm commenting on a social media post. So I tend to do that more in written form than
I think that's probably because you're trying to be emphatic, and it's hard to do that in writing.
Yes. And use of emojis as well. There's a lot of use of emojis. I want to get my point across, make sure people don't mistake it. Thanks again. This was amazing.
Well, thank you. I really have enjoyed it. Thank you for all the great questions. There's so many.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing to listening to the book and seeing and hearing those examples from each chapter. Thanks so much to our audience. If you'd like to join us again, we have a few upcoming programs that I'd like to highlight. On May 16th, we'll have a hybrid program, so it'll be in person, but you can also watch it on live stream with the author of The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples, and the Unmaking of U.S. History. On May 23rd, we'll be talking to Simon Winchester about his new book, Knowing What We Know, The Transmission of Knowledge from Ancient Wisdom to Modern Magic. And on May 30th, we'll be talking to the author of For the Culture, The Power Behind What We Buy, What We Do, and Who We Want to Be. So some really interesting topics coming up this month. So join us again. Oh, and if you can join us for the at the museum for a tour, that'd be awesome too. We're open every day. Check our website for more information on our hours, and you can visit our brand new exhibit, For Business or Pleasure, Twain Summer Sojourns, which focuses on the Clemens family's American summer vacations between 1870 and 1910. Thanks again to Valerie and Tamaya, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.